Hey, 9th and 10th graders, Guy here and I, because that's an original name for a dog, Guy, are here to read to you chapter 12. Yeah, he makes the picture better. Here we go. Chapter 12. Isn't Christianity anti-science? Section 1. The battle between Christianity and science. In Cosmos in Theological Scriptures, a scholarly article published in a journal dealing with space, science, and law, Indian attorney Gurbachan Singh Sachdeva, and I'm sure I said his name really, really wrong, asserts the following. This is what he said, though. He said, Christian interpretations of the origin of the universe, as per the Christian Bible, are generally well known. Christianity believes that the earth is the stationary center of our solar system and everything else revolves around it, including the sun. Man, the supreme earthly being, came to inhabit the earth as the progeny of Adam, who was expelled from heaven for his sin of having tasted the forbidden fruit that impelled him to commit the sin of fornication. In punishment, he was dropped onto the earth to live in loneliness so that he could repent for his cardinal sin. Later, in compassion, God created Eve out of the rib of Adam to give him company and as consort. Cohabitation followed, and the result has been mankind on earth. Yeah. Sachdeva has nearly every aspect of the biblical creation narrative wrong. But one wonders how many of his readers, in accepting the larger point of his article, also unthinkingly accept his account of Scripture. That Sachdeva's account made it into a scholarly journal, presumably concerned with accuracy, may be a rather odd illustration of the tension between science and Christianity, but it serves to highlight a larger debate over whether science is supreme and Christianity is merely a quaint superstition. To many scientists, one cannot be both religious and intelligent at the same time. Famed biologist Edward O. Wilson put it this way: the human mind evolved to believe in the gods. It did not evolve to believe in biology. The uncomfortable truth is that the two beliefs are not factually compatible. As a result, those who hunger for both intellectual and religious truth will never acquire both in full measure. Of course, there are scientists who dispute this science versus religion framing. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institute of Health and the scientist who headed up the Human Genome Project, which mapped the entire human deoxyribonucleic acid, that's DNA sequence, said science is not threatened by God, it is enhanced. God is most certainly not threatened by science. He made it all possible. So which point is closer to the truth? Are science and religion, specifically Christianity in this case, compatible, or are they going to be forever at odds? Some faith systems are incompatible with science, but Christianity is not one of them. The Bible describes a God who is orderly and knowable, and who made a world that consists of knowable reality. See that in Psalm 8. Jesus Christ is presented as the creator of everything both visible and invisible, Colossians 1:16. As we will see, modern science was founded on these assumptions. Only in the past 2 centuries or so has science come to be seen as incompatible with and superior to Christianity. It is possible that those who view Christianity and science as incompatible have observed something that somehow escaped the notice of everyone who has lived in the last 2,000 years. But is it also possible that modern assumptions have somehow colored people's perceptions and caused them to miss a greater truth? To answer this question, we need to closely examine what science actually is, its history, the contributions of Christians to the field, the limits of science, and whether the supposed conflicts between the Bible's claims and the claims of science can be reasonably explained. Sorry, gotta get you in the right spot. Section 2, a straightforward way to think about the Bible and science. The National Academy of Science defines science as the use of evidence to construct testable explanation and prediction of natural phenomena, as well as the knowledge generated through this process, and holds that scientists gather information by observing the natural world and conducting experiments. Science assumes that nature operates in a predictable, stable manner, and that the results we obtain in any given case will yield similar results under similar conditions. This assumption about the orderliness and predictability of nature, indeed a great many of science's underlying assumptions, is based on principles that early scientists believed because they believed in the God of the Bible. This is not to say that the Bible is a book of science. It's bigger than that. The Bible, as we saw in earlier chapters, presents an overarching story, a meta-narrative about the world and everyone in it from the perspective of a sovereign God and his plan for the world. Though the Bible is not a book of science, it is not against science either. The relationship of science to the Bible is similar to the relationship between photography and the study of history. Just as science helps clarify our observations of nature, photography enables accurate pictures to be made. Accuracy does help tell better stories, but photographs themselves are not the story, nor are they the only or best way of telling. Just as it would be foolish to say that there was no history before there was photography, it is foolish to say that people's pre-scientific thoughts were ignorant and now irrelevant. But this is an unfair analogy, some might protest. Science makes our observations more accurate, which enables us to make superior decisions to those made in more Christian times. This is a serious point and one worth examining. It is true that there are many examples of how people in more Christian times made bad or bizarre decisions, but people have done bad and bizarre things in the name of science too. Physics and engineering made possible weapons that are far deadlier than those used in previous centuries, and sometimes scientists even distort the truth for their own purposes, as happened with Soviet scientist T.J. Lysenko, who outlawed dissent from his theory of genetics because he believed that contrary thought would pose a threat to Marxism and upset the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. As we will see, the relationship between Christianity and science is not what people imagine. It certainly does not fit the "we're smarter than we used to be, so we need to reject Christianity" narrative. The truth is much more complex and much more fascinating. Section 3, How Christianity Brought About Modern Scientists. Everyone has heard the story of Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree, thinking deep thoughts, when all of a sudden an apple fell on his head and inspired him to discover the law of gravity. The story is so popular that descendants of the purported tree have been replanted in significant locations, including at Trinity College of Cambridge University, outside the window of the room where Newton lived and studied. Unfortunately, what really happened hardly keeps our interest. Newton did report a falling apple, and he did muse about why the fall of apples is perpendicular, rather than sideways, to the ground. But it took 2 decades for Newton to work out his subsequent thoughts about planetary motion and propose the law of gravity in the Principia, which was a tome of more than 450 pages. Clearly, though, stories have immense power. According to British social scientist Philip J. Sampson, people tend to remember and believe well-told stories, even if they're false, which might explain why so many believe that it was scientists who bravely rejected church authority and exalted reason, and thus set people free from superstitious ignorance. Christianity, by this narrative, is illicitly grasping for control in the face of scientific truth. Sampson traces this narrative back to Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who thought that religious beliefs threatened acceptance of Charles Darwin's theory. But is this a battle of truth or a battle of stories about truth? Was Huxley stating things as they actually were, or glossing over complexities in order to replace one set of stories with another? Huxley did seem to resent Christianity, even forming the Sunday Lecture Society as an alternative to church to promote learning free of what he considered to be religious dogma. After Huxley, late 19th century historians such as John W. Draper and Andrew D. White promoted science by writing derisively of Christianity. They invented and used stories to perpetuate the myths that supported scientific progress, such as Christopher Columbus's conquering religious superstition about the earth being a flat disk with Jerusalem at the center, by fearlessly sailing toward the earth's supposed edge. White gleefully repeated the story of Pope Calixtus III, horrified at the arrival of Halley's Comet, excommunicating it as an agent of the devil. Neither account has any factual basis. All educated people at the time of Columbus knew the earth was round, and the story of the Pope excommunicating a comet was made up. Both stories have nonetheless been trumpeted as evidence of Christianity being anti-science. Another example often enlisted to portray Christianity as anti-science is that of Galileo Galilei's interrogation at the hands of the Catholic Church in 1633. Secularist philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, for instance, said Galileo, as everyone knows, was condemned by the Inquisition. He recanted and promised never again to maintain that the earth rotates or revolves. The Inquisition was successful at putting an end to science in Italy and did considerable damage to the church by its stupidity. Contrary to Russell's telling, Sampson quotes prominent Galileo scholars in labeling the Galileo versus the Inquisitors story a simplistic myth. More accurately, he says Galileo's interrogation resulted from complex intrigues of politics and patronage and wounded pride rather than a conflict over whether the earth revolves around the sun or the sun around the earth. Basically, what happened is this. Galileo's research confirmed some central aspects of Nicholas Copernicus's theory that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. Galileo sent his results to Pope Paul V, who responded warmly and offered to support the theory provisionally, pending further evidence. Rather than doing additional research to provide such evidence, though, Galileo picked fights with his fellow scientists, who he thought were questioning his brilliance by proving some aspects of his thesis wrong. He also quarreled with Vatican theologians by attempting to interpret the Bible in ways that Roman Catholic Church leaders found to be rebellious. At a time when the Protestant Reformation was in full swing, this was a definite no-no. And still the Church responded to Galileo in mild and restrained ways until he published a parable that included a character named Simplicio, simpleton, into whose mouth he put the words of the new Pope, Urban VIII. Brought on trial for heresy, the Church still tried to treat the now aging and sickly Galileo with kindness by providing a luxurious apartment at the Vatican and a personal valet during the trial. Mocking the Vatican court during his trial, Galileo was eventually sentenced to live out his days at a country house in Florence, cared for by his daughter. Even Alfred North Whitehead, Russell's one-time co-author, pointed out that contrary to tales of Galileo being imprisoned in a dank dungeon and threatened with torture, he suffered an honorable detention and a mild reproof before dying peacefully in his bed. When all the facts are known, the Galileo story is not one of science versus religion. Galileo himself didn't believe that religion and science were in conflict. Rather, he wrote admiringly of God's design for the mind. He said this, "When I consider what marvelous things and how many of them men have understood, inquired into, and contrived, I recognize and understand only too clearly that the human mind is a work of God's, and one of the most excellent." The story of an age of ignorance in which religious superstitions suppressed the development of science now appears to be a false history designed to make Christianity look villainous. As Warren C. Hollister, a distinguished medievalist, said, anyone who believes that the era that witnessed the building of Chartres Cathedral and the invention of Parliament and the university was dark must be deeply, deeply ignorant. Although some may find the Christianity as villain and science as savior narrative compelling, the truth is actually more interesting. Science assumes an orderly universe. If the universe were disorderly or chaotic, we couldn't expect it to behave in a predictable, comprehensible, meaningful manner. For instance, we could not reasonably assume that Newton's apple would always fall down. Perhaps it would hit a pocket of chaos and fall up, or travel sideways, or aim directly for a neighbor's plate glass window. But why should we assume that our universe is orderly and predictable? To distinguished scholar of science and religion John Hedley Brooke, early scientists assumed that there were laws of nature only because there had been a legislator. And by legislator, they mean a creator. Indeed, a great deal of modern science was born out of Christian beliefs. Theologian Francis Schaeffer wrote, since the world had been created by a reasonable God, scientists were not surprised to find a correlation between themselves as observers and the thing observed, that is, between subject and object. Without this foundation, modern Western science would not have been born. Holmes Ralston III, distinguished professor of philosophy at Colorado State University, likewise explains, it was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science, for it premised an intelligible world, sacred but disenchanted, a world with blueprint, which was therefore open to the searches of the scientists. The great pioneers in physics, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidences of God in the physical world. Even Einstein, much later and in a different era, when puzzling over how space and time were made, used to ask himself how God would have arranged the matter. A universe of such beauty, an earth given over to life and to culture, such phenomena imply a transcending power adequate to account for these productive workings in the world. American scholar Ian Barber points out the world's oldest scientific society, the Royal Society of London, instructed its fellows to direct their studies to the glory of God and the benefits of the human race, and notes that these early scientists identified themselves with the Christian tradition in which they were nourished, and many of them seem to have experienced a personal response of reverence and awe toward the marvels they beheld. He explains, expressions of awed surprise and admiration of the skill of the Creator dot the pages of their writings. The sense of the grandeur and wisdom of God was evidently a very positive experience for many of them, and not just an abstract intellectual formula or a concession to cultural respectability. Similarly, philosopher and historian of science Stanley Jockey noted that the belief in creation and the Creator formed the bedrock on which science rose. Jockey's perspective is especially noteworthy because as a Catholic priest and influential philosopher, he was well versed in both religion and science. Jockey maintained that the belief in a personal, rational Creator, as cultivated especially within a Christian matrix, supported the view for which the world was an objective and orderly entity, investigable by the mind because the mind too was an orderly and objective product of the same rational, that is, perfectly consistent Creator. Ralston, Barber, and Jockey are by no means uneducated observers, and their conclusion is clear. Science is possible because God was believed by early scientists to be, as the Bible describes him, a God of reason and order. Christianity, then, was the mother of modern science. Skeptics may scoff, but today's scientific breakthroughs are possible because of tools forged in a faith-based belief system. So, who were these early scientists so committed to a Christian view of the world? We've already mentioned Isaac Newton. Another was Robert Boyle, a founder of modern chemistry and the discoverer of Boyle's law, which describes the relationship between the pressure and volume of a gas. Boyle wrote a book called The Christian Virtuoso, in which he described what it would take for a Christian to be an outstanding scientist, or as he termed it, experimental philosopher. His criteria included being without material ambition, so he's not in it for the money, truth-focused, humble, honorable, devout, and in submission to the authority of nature and not of other men. So, saying what you actually find, not lying about it or saying what other men want you to say. Boyle was well known for trying to live up to this code, and it is hard to imagine other scientists in Oxford and in the Royal Society being uninfluenced by his views. John Hedley Brooke thus observes of Boyle and his contemporaries. Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton saw the study of nature as a religious duty. A knowledge of God's power and wisdom could be inferred from the intelligence seemingly displayed in the designs of nature. Newton affirmed that the natural sciences had prospered only in monotheistic cultures. He believed the universality of his laws was grounded in the omnipresence of a single divine will. Boyle and Newton, however, were hardly the only self-proclaimed Christians who became revered scientists. Another example, English philosopher Francis Bacon, is credited with establishing the scientific method as the ruling method for investigation. Committed to his craft and his faith, he used distinctly biblical language to describe the idols that could corrupt science, such as self-deception, prejudice, misuse of words, and false persuasion. Summarizing Bacon's view, Harvard historian of science Stephen Shapin says, "We are human, all too human. We are fallen and fallible, and such is our fate." Bacon's theology, rooted in the biblical idea that humans are subject to sin, was the basis of the careful, studious approach to discovery that he pioneered. So what caused the breakup between science and Christianity? Apparently, as science moved into the 18th century, it's the age of enlightenment again, those promoting the Enlightenment came to believe that rationality and systematic thinking could cure humanity's fall into sin and restore virtue. Faith in rationality began to replace faith in God. Science became a form of worship. Famous historian of science George Sarton admitted as much when he described science as the very anchor of our philosophy, of our morality, of our faith. Today, we are still experiencing vibrations from the earthquake that we now know as the Age of Enlightenment, and some of those vibrations opened a rift between science and Christianity that seems to be widening to this day. Section 4. Are faith and science locked in mortal combat? David Berlinski is a mathematician and brilliant writer. Jewish by heritage and secular by conviction, he is nonetheless critical of those who pit faith against science. Both are necessary, he says, quoting Albert Einstein, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." Voices like Berlinski's, though, seem to be getting drowned out. Victor Stenger, a leading atheist who died in 2014, asserted, "Faith is belief in the absence of supportive evidence and even in the light of contrary evidence. Science makes no such assumptions on faith." He said, "Using the empirical method, science has eliminated smallpox, flown men to the moon, and discovered DNA. Relying on faith, religion has brought us inquisitions, holy wars, and intolerance." To Stenger, it is clear that not only is there a battle between belief, represented by religion and philosophy, and knowledge, represented by science, but that science has won a clear victory. All that remains is for religious people to have the good sense to surrender. In this chapter, we will suggest that the science versus faith battle Stenger outlined is much more nuanced than he seemed to believe for two reasons. First, science is consistent with the Christian faith. We must keep in mind that saying that science has eliminated smallpox, flown men to the moon, and discovered DNA is a kind of shorthand that makes science appear to be more powerful than it really is. In fact, science is not a force of nature, but rather the result of the work of individuals who create breakthroughs by practicing the disciplines of repeatedly observing, measuring, and experimenting. To do this, scientists must assume that the universe operates in observable, measurable, and repeatable ways, assumptions that are entirely consistent with the testimony of Scripture, if not derived directly from a Christian worldview. Still, many feel comfortable with near worship of science. Physicist Stephen Hawking has crowed, "Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." But as Oxford mathematician John Lennox points out, Hawking's assertion is a philosophical statement, not a scientific one. Scientists might be proud of their achievements, but most recognize the limits of their craft. A few, such as Stenger, Hawking, and Dawkins, seem to enjoy cutting loose with the occasional victory howl, but most just keep their heads down and continue their work. Christians should have no problem embracing scientific as well as philosophical religious ways of knowing. After all, if one starts with a designer, a person expects to find design in the world. This is why scholars such as Rodney Stark say it is precisely because of their religious convictions about design and order, not in spite of them, that the world's greatest scientists succeeded. Moreover, it was Christianity in particular, rather than Islam, New Age spirituality, or any of the atheistic humanisms, that was most responsible for this success. Christians founded chemistry, paleontology, bacteriology, antiseptic surgery, genetics, thermodynamics, computer science, and many other fields. If these breakthroughs come because of the faith of scientists rather than in spite of it, and strong evidence indicates that they do, then to pit faith against science is to misunderstand both faith and science. Second, naturalistic science is based on faith. Physicist and best-selling author Paul Davies, a respected scientist who is not a Christian believer, makes an interesting claim. Science has its own faith-based belief system. When Davies asked colleagues why the laws of physics are what they are, they replied, "That's not a scientific question," or "Nobody knows," or, and most revealing, "There is no reason they are what they are, they just are." In short, science cannot account for the underlying truths that make it work. Scientists, Davies concludes, operate by faith. Until science comes up with a testable theory of the laws of the universe, he says, its claim to be free of faith is manifestly bogus. The next time someone implies that science is somehow the good guy while religion is the bad guy, you might consider pressing forward with such questions as these. What is science? Or, if the universe is the product of chance, why is it reasonable to expect it to function as if it were designed in a way that we can understand? Or, what evidence do you have that only scientists who lack faith in design accomplish anything? At the very least, such questions can spark an interesting conversation. Perhaps they'll also leave the other person thinking more deeply about both faith and science. So if science is a faith-based enterprise, based on faith in the orderliness of the world and operating by principles about the world for which it cannot account, what are those principles? We've addressed one already, how the lawfulness of the universe, without which scientific investigation is not possible, derives from a belief in a divine creator. Yet the lawfulness of the universe is not the only scientific principle made uniquely possible by the Christian worldview. In their book, The Soul of Science, Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton list 7 more. One, which is actually 2 because they already gave you one. Nature is valuable enough to study, as opposed to the ancient Greek belief that nature was transient and therefore relatively unimportant. Nature is good, but not God. This is opposed to animistic religions that leave nature alone because it is the exclusive abode of the gods. Nature is orderly. This is opposed to religions that taught that the world is unpredictable because it is ruled by a pantheon of unruly and unpredictable gods. Nature's laws can be precisely stated and understood, as opposed to ancient religions that taught that creation was too mysterious to be consistently known. Humans can discover nature's order, as opposed to the ancient Eastern belief that nature was not the product of a rational mind and therefore not subject to rational thinking. Detailed observation is possible and important, as opposed to Aristotle's thinking that if an object's purpose was understood, detailed observation of it was unnecessary. The universe is rationally intelligible because God is rationally intelligent, as opposed to philosophies that trust limited human intelligence as the as opposed to philosophies that trust limited human intelligence as the only kind that really exists. These assumptions, consistent with biblical revelation, inspired some of the world's greatest scientists to develop the enterprise we call modern science. Today, though, there are many disagreements among Christians themselves about what the Bible teaches regarding science. Let's take a look at these differences and see if we can find common ground. Back in a bit.